Imagine feeling invisible in your marriage, your partner too busy to notice you. Then someone unexpected enters your world, someone you know you should never desire. What happens when that line between loyalty and temptation starts to blur? Let's dive into a story of passion, guilt, and betrayal. Meet Sarah, a woman in her 40s, who thought she had everything: a successful marriage to her husband, John, a solid career, and a beautiful home. But as the years passed, John became distant, his attention consumed by work. Sarah tried everything, planning intimate evenings, surprising him with thoughtful gestures, but he never noticed. Then one day someone else caught her eye: Ethan. Ethan, her 24-year-old stepson, had just moved back into their home. The young man who had once been a child in her life had grown into someone completely different, a man she couldn't ignore. And so began a forbidden desire, a secret that would change. Sarah had always been the perfect wife. She was devoted to John, did everything in her power to support him, but as the years wore on, she began to feel more and more invisible. John's constant work trips left her alone, and she struggled to find a connection that made her feel seen. When Ethan came back to live with them, Sarah tried to stay focused on her marriage, but it was hard. Ethan was charismatic, easy to talk to, and unlike anyone she had been around in years, he seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and feelings, something that had been missing from her life for too long. At first, she told herself it was harmless, just friendly conversations. But those moments started to linger. Every smile, every laugh, every compliment, each one made her feel more desired than she had in a long time. The attraction grew, even though she knew it was wrong. Ethan was her stepson. She had no business feeling this way. One evening, after a long day of work, Sarah was relaxing in the living room when Ethan sat down beside her. He was always so kind, always paying attention to her. They started talking about life, about the past, about things Sarah hadn't thought about in years. She felt a spark of something inside her, but she quickly brushed it off. She was married. She had to stay loyal. But then the unexpected happened. As they watched a movie together, their hands brushed. For a moment, Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She tried to pull her hand away, but Ethan's fingers lingered. The connection between them was undeniable, and she felt like she couldn't breathe. "Are you all right?" Ethan's voice was soft, genuine. Sarah nodded, but inside she was torn. She shouldn't be feeling this way, but it felt so right. That night, after John left for another trip, Sarah found herself alone with Ethan. There was no denying it now. The attraction had crossed the line. It was more than just physical. There was an intensity, a chemistry that both of them felt. When Ethan kissed her, there was no turning back. She kissed him back, giving in to a desire that had been building for months. But with the kiss came the guilt. Sarah knew it was wrong. She knew it was betrayal, but she couldn't stop. It all began innocently enough. Sarah didn't want to acknowledge the growing attraction she felt for Ethan. After all, he was her stepson. And any thoughts beyond the most basic of relationships were completely off limits. But as time passed, the small things started to matter. Ethan's bright smile, his ability to make her laugh when she felt down, and the way he would listen to her talk about things that had long been ignored in her own marriage. Sarah found herself looking forward to those moments more than she cared to admit. The small talks after dinner, the lingering glances across the dinner table. She found herself noticing Ethan more, how his laughter seemed to fill the room, how his eyes sparkled when he talked about his future, how different he was from John. Ethan was vibrant, youthful, and full of energy. In contrast, John had become a shadow of his former self, tired, distant, and consumed by work. At first, Sarah brushed off the growing tension. She convinced herself that it was harmless. A brief glance here, a light touch there, nothing more than friendly affection. But deep down, she knew something was changing. What started as a fleeting thought began to grow into something more intense, something impossible to ignore. One evening, Sarah found herself sitting in the living room, her feet tucked up under a blanket as she sipped her wine. The soft hum of the television was the only sound, but her mind was elsewhere, focusing on Ethan. He was sitting beside her, flipping through his phone, but she couldn't help but notice the way his body was positioned so close to hers. The air between them felt thick, charged with unspoken energy. He glanced over at her and smiled. It was one of those smiles, the kind that lingered for a moment too long, like it said more than words ever could. "You're looking good tonight, Sarah," he said. His voice light, but with an undertone of something she couldn't quite place. The compliment startled her. It wasn't the first time he'd said something like that, but this time it hit differently. She forced a smile, trying to downplay it, but she could feel her cheeks flush. "Thanks, Ethan," she murmured, her voice betraying the nervous flutter in her stomach. It wasn't just his words. It was his presence. Everything about him seemed to demand her attention now. As much as she tried to focus on the movie or her own thoughts, she found her eyes drifting back to him again and again. The way he moved, the casual confidence in his manner, the way his body seemed. Or to fill up the space around her, it made her feel things she wasn't ready to confront. That night, when the movie ended, Ethan offered to help clean up the kitchen. Sarah, not really thinking, agreed. It was just another task to do, another routine part of the evening. But when they stood side by side washing dishes, the proximity was undeniable. She could feel the heat radiating off him. His fingers brushed hers once as they passed the dish towel between them, and it was as if an electric charge went through her. She quickly pulled her hand back, suddenly feeling the weight of the moment, but Ethan didn't seem to notice the awkwardness. He continued washing the dishes, humming a tune under his breath. Sarah couldn't focus on the task anymore. Her thoughts were consumed with the way his arm had brushed against hers, the casual intimacy of the moment. It was something she hadn't realized. She'd missed, someone who made her feel seen, alive. The next few days were harder. Every time she saw Ethan, she felt the pull of attraction stronger than before. The physical attraction was undeniable. His dark hair, his tall, lean frame, the way he looked at her when they talked. But it wasn't just his looks. It was the way he made her feel. Young again, wanted, and desired. For so long she had felt invisible to John, but Ethan's attention, though seemingly innocent, made her feel everything she had been missing. One afternoon, as Sarah sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone, Ethan sat across from her, his eyes fixated on something in his lap. There was an air of tension between them, an unspoken understanding that neither of them could ignore. After a long silence, Ethan spoke. "You've been quiet lately? Is everything okay with you and John?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't ready for this conversation, but she couldn't lie to him either. It's fine," she replied, avoiding his gaze. "Just the usual. He's been working a lot." Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes still locked on hers. "I don't mean to pry, but it seems like you're not really happy." He said it softly, but the truth of his words cut through her like a knife. She had been trying to keep up the appearance of a perfect life, but deep down she knew Ethan could see through her. "I'm just tired," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Tired of trying, tired of being ignored. The silence between them grew heavy, the weight of Sarah's words sinking in. Ethan didn't respond right away, but when he finally looked up, his gaze was full of something she couldn't quite name. It was sympathy, yes, but also something more, something like longing. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice softening. "You deserve better than that." Sarah swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. There was a vulnerability in his words, an empathy that made her want to lean into him, to let him take the weight off her shoulders. She could feel her walls crumbling, the carefully constructed boundaries she'd built around herself, beginning to fall apart. She wanted him. She wanted someone to make her feel something real. It was then that she realized this wasn't just a fleeting attraction. She had crossed a line emotionally, if not physically, and there was no going back. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah's secret life with Ethan became a whirlwind of emotions. Every stolen moment felt both exhilarating and devastating. She tried to balance her marriage, but every time she saw Ethan, every time their eyes met, the weight of her guilt grew heavier. One night, Sarah stood in front of the mirror in the bathroom, her hands shaking. She had just spent hours with Ethan, and the guilt was suffocating. Was she really doing this? Was this the woman she had become? A woman who would risk her family for a forbidden love? Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. It was John, home earlier than expected. His tired face greeted her, but Sarah couldn't meet his eyes. He had no idea what was happening. She had become a stranger in her own home. As time passed, Sarah's secret affair with Ethan had become a whirlwind of emotions. The guilt she felt grew heavier with each passing day. One evening, after John left for another business trip, Sarah was left alone in the house, feeling a growing sense of dread. She knew that with his absence came a choice she had to make, one that would change everything. That night, her encounter with Ethan would mark the beginning of a new chapter, one that would alter their lives forever. The affair had already consumed Sarah's thoughts, and every stolen moment with Ethan felt like a desperate attempt to escape the reality of her marriage. The chemistry between them was undeniable. Each touch, each look, felt like an unspoken confession of everything she had been hiding. But the guilt gnawed at her, especially when she looked at John. She could no longer ignore the growing distance between them. Her heart was torn, caught between the love she still had for her husband and the forbidden desire that she couldn't seem to control. One evening, as the house settled into its usual quiet, John left on another business trip. Sarah, though relieved to have the house to herself, felt an overwhelming sense of dread. She knew that with his absence came a choice she would have to make, one that would change everything. She found herself wandering through the house aimlessly. It wasn't long before she bumped into Ethan, who was sitting on the couch reading. He looked up at her, a faint smile crossing his lips. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. She could see the desire in his eyes, the same hunger that had been building between them. But tonight it was different. Tonight, the air between them was thick with tension. "I didn't expect you to still be awake," Sarah said, her voice faltering slightly. She hadn't planned on staying up, but she couldn't bring herself to go to bed. The guilt, the excitement, the fear, it was all weighing on her. Ethan closed the book he was reading, his gaze never leaving her. "I was waiting for you. I need to talk to you." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She didn't want to hear what he had to say. She knew what it would be. There was no going back from this. But she couldn't walk away either. "About what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She was trying to steady her emotions, but her heart was racing and her palms were sweating. Ethan stood up slowly, walking toward her with a purpose. "About us," he said, his voice low, almost as if he were testing the waters. "I can't keep pretending like nothing is happening between us. Every time I see you, I feel like I'm drowning in this need for you. I don't want to fight it anymore." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the stomach. Her chest tightened, and for a moment, it felt like the world around her disappeared. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heart, louder than anything else. She wanted to push him away, to tell him to stop, to make this all go away. But she couldn't. She stepped back, her mind racing. "We can't," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. "This is wrong, Ethan. You're my stepson. We can't do this." But as she looked into his eyes, she saw the truth of what he was saying. He wasn't asking anymore. He wasn't waiting for her to decide. His emotions were clear in the intensity of his gaze. The hunger, the desire, the longing, and Sarah felt it too, in every fiber of her being. "I know it's wrong," Ethan said, his voice shaking with emotion. "But I can't stop. And I don't want to anymore. I want you, Sarah. I've wanted you since the moment we started talking. And I can't pretend I don't feel it. Don't make me wait, please." The vulnerability in his words, the raw honesty, hit her harder than anything. She'd been waiting for someone to speak to her this way, to make her feel alive again, to make her feel important. It was a confession of need, and it was everything she had been craving. Her knees felt weak. The weight of the decision crashed down on her, and she could barely hold herself together. "This isn't just about desire, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling. "This is a betrayal of everything I've worked for. I love John. I can't hurt him like this." But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they didn't have the same weight they once did. She wasn't sure if she was trying to convince him or herself. Ethan closed the space between them, his hand reaching out to touch her arm, gently, but with purpose. It was the kind of touch that spoke volumes, that told her everything he couldn't say aloud. She felt the heat of his skin, the unmistakable connection that had been building between them, and in that moment she couldn't think of anything else. She was lost in the pull of his presence, the way he made her feel seen, desired. "Don't you want this too?" he asked softly, his voice barely a breath. His face was inches from hers, his lips almost brushing against her cheek. Sarah closed her eyes, her heart pounding. She wanted to say no. She wanted to push him away and remind herself of her vows, of the life she had built with John. But it felt like a lifetime ago. Everything about her marriage seemed distant now, compared to the fire that burned inside her whenever Ethan was near. Before she could stop herself, before she could rationalize the moment away, she found herself leaning into him. Their lips met in a kiss, soft at first, hesitant, like they were both afraid of what they were about to do. But as the kiss deepened, all hesitation vanished. The desire, the need surged through her. She kissed him back fiercely, as if everything she had been holding back for so long had come rushing to the surface. It was more than just a kiss. It was a breaking point. It was everything Sarah had been denying herself, everything she had tried to ignore. The thrill of the forbidden, the ache of longing, the pleasure of being desired. She surrendered to it all. But as they pulled away, Breathless, Sarah's heart twisted with guilt. What had she done? What was she becoming? The woman who had vowed to protect her family, to honor her marriage, had just crossed a line that she couldn't uncross. And in that moment, as she looked into Ethan's eyes, she knew that their world had changed forever. There would be no going back. Sarah's story is one of deep emotional conflict. She had everything she thought she wanted: a stable marriage, a life that many envied. But when that stability crumbled, she found herself caught in a web of passion and guilt that she couldn't escape. Betrayal wasn't just about lying to John, it was about lying to herself. Desire can cloud judgment, and sometimes, when we feel invisible or unheard, we make choices that lead to consequences we never expected. The thrill of the forbidden can be intoxicating, but it always comes at a price. If you found this story as intense and captivating as I did, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join us for more tales of love, betrayal, and the choices that change everything. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Subscribe now and be a part of this journey.